The morning it came undone, Delia Marsh was standing in the center of the great hall at Harwell, with a ledger in her hands, and 37 members of the household arranged in a loose crescent before her, none of them looking at her face. They were looking at Cornelius Fenn. He had called the assembly himself, which was unusual, and he had positioned himself at the head of the crescent, with the authority of a man who had held this hall's confidences for 30 years and intended to hold them 30 more. He was not a large man, but he was precise in the way that certain clerks become precise with age. His coat brushed, his collar stiff, his hands folded at his waist, as though the morning were already ordered to his satisfaction. He had the stillness of someone who had spent a lifetime arranging rooms and knew how to fill one. "I will not insult this household," he said, his voice carrying the easy, measured weight of a man addressing inferiors from long habit, "by dwelling on the specifics of what has been alleged. I will say only this. The girl has been in His Grace's employ for 11 months. She is a maid. She has access to one corridor of the East Wing, and to the laundry linens. She has no authority over the estate's accounts, no knowledge of estate business, and no standing to bring accusations of any kind against a man of my position and tenure." His eyes came to rest on Delia once, briefly, then moved away as though she were a piece of furniture he had assessed and found unremarkable. The ledger in her hands was not the estate's. It was her father's, small and dark, with a torn corner on the lower left cover where the binding had caught on a nail in his schoolroom desk years before he died. It held his own accounts, his patient figures, his handwriting that still looked to her, in certain lights, like a conversation she had not finished. She held it because it was the only thing she had kept from him, and because when she had found the first discrepancy in the Harwell accounts, it had been her father's method of cross-checking that had shown her where to look. She looked at Fenn now, and said nothing. She was 23 years old, and she had been a maid for 11 months, and she had been many other things before that. But none of them had been heard in this hall. What she did not know yet was that she was not alone. If you have ever wondered what quiet courage looks like from the outside, stay with this story. It is worth staying for. Thomas Marsh had been the schoolmaster of Kingmore Village, 8 miles south of Harwell, for 22 years. He had taught the children of tenant farmers and tradesmen in a schoolroom that smelled of chalk dust and damp wool, and he had kept the village accounts as a service to the parish, and he had taught his daughter figures the way other fathers taught their daughters needlework, with patience and pleasure, and the conviction that a mind capable of following a column of numbers to its error was a mind that would never be easily deceived. She had been 6 years old when she first sat beside him at his desk and watched him set out a ledger. She had been 9 when he let her keep one of her own. By the time she was 16, she could spot an addition error in a column of 40 figures without writing down the sum. And by 18, she had developed what her father called the instinct, which was not mystical at all, but was simply the accumulated habit of attention. The way the eye knows a room has something missing before it has identified what. He had died in the autumn of the previous year, of a fever that came on quickly and left as quickly, taking him in 4 days. What it left behind was a box of papers, a small house with a lease that expired 3 months later, a schoolroom full of slates, and a debt of £62 that Delia had not known existed. The debt was to a supplier in the county town for paper and ink and chalk that had arrived in quantity the season before and been paid for, her father had believed, by the parish account that had in fact been emptied by the churchwarden's son over 2 years of quiet misappropriation that no one had yet examined. She had sold the furniture and paid the debt, and had £18 left. She had stood in the empty schoolroom the morning before she left it, and looked at the slates still stacked on the shelves and the ink-stained wood of her father's desk, and understood that grief is not one thing, but several things occurring at once, including the grief of a place that will be filled by strangers before the month is out. She had come to Harwell because Mrs. Yateley had known Thomas Marsh, and because a housekeeper who had known her father was a housekeeper who would not require her to articulate the particular quality of her desperation. Mrs. Yateley had hired her without ceremony and placed her in the East Wing corridor, which was the quietest corridor in the house, and Delia had understood this also as a form of consideration. The work was repetitive and physical, and it left her enough of herself at the end of each day to sit at the small table in her room and read, or to walk the kitchen garden in the last of the evening light, when the head gardener was gone and the beds were empty, and the air had that particular autumn cold that was not yet winter, but knew where it was going. She did not complain. She did not confide. She kept her father's small ledger in the pocket of her working apron, which no one knew, and she kept his handwriting available to her in the quiet moments, which was more comfort than she would have been able to explain. The estate itself was large in the way of old houses that have accumulated wings and passages over 2 centuries without much reference to one another, so that certain corridors arrived without warning at unexpected doors and certain staircases wound into rooms that no longer had an obvious purpose. Delia found her way through it by the same method she found her way through figures, beginning with what was certain and building outward from there. She knew the East Wing by her 2nd week. She knew the kitchen passage and the laundry and the servants' stair by the 3rd. By the 4th week, she knew the smell of each room before she entered it, the particular way the morning light fell through the tall windows of the upper corridor, and the sound the 4th step of the back stair made if you put your weight on the left side rather than the right. Mrs. Yateley had given her the East Wing corridor in part because it held the estate's small library. It was not the great library on the ground floor, which was formal and smelled of old calf leather and was not touched between one season visit and the next. It was the working library, a single room lined with shelves that held estate records going back 60 years, reference volumes on agriculture and drainage, a collection of periodicals belonging to the previous Duke, and a window seat with faded cushions that looked out over the north kitchen garden. Delia cleaned the grate in that room every Tuesday morning. She was meticulous about not reading what was left on the table. This discipline held for 4 months. It broke on a Tuesday in March, when the estate accounts were left open on the reading table, because the young understeward had been called from the room in the middle of his work and had not returned, and because the column of figures on the open page produced in Delia, the moment her eye fell on it, an immediate and specific discomfort. The sum allocated to the quarry for the repair of the North Drive was 4 times what the previous year's record showed for the same work. That alone might have been explained by any number of things she did not know. What could not be explained was that the same page recorded the delivery of the stone as having occurred in April of the prior year, and she had been at Harwell in April, and she had seen no stone delivered to the North Drive. She closed the accounts and finished the grate, and went back to her corridor. She spent 3 days telling herself it was not her business, which was a statement she had no difficulty making and considerable difficulty believing. On the 4th day, tidying the small library, she found the kitchen delivery receipt stored in the cabinet beside the door. She had been looking for a reference volume on drainage for the head gardener who had asked her to find it, and the cabinet had been unlocked. She had not intended to open it past the first shelf. She opened it past the first shelf because the receipts were not the drainage volume, but they were organized in the same manner as her father's parish records, and the organization of accounts had a grammar she read instinctively, and the grammar of these was wrong. She sat down on the window seat with the delivery receipts in her lap and her father's small ledger beside them, and she worked through the figures with the careful, methodical attention he had taught her, and she found what she was looking for in less than an hour. A receipt from the Henton Quarry for 12 cords of stone, billed to the Harwell estate accounts. The delivery address on the receipt was not the North Drive. It was a house in the village of Kingmore, a house she recognized as belonging to the steward. She put the receipts back in their proper order. She returned the drainage volume to the gardener. She went back to her corridor and cleaned the grates and turned down the beds and brought the evening linens to the laundry. And all the while the figures sat in her mind with the clarity of things that are certain and the weight of things that are costly to act on. She had watched her father's life be diminished by a theft he never found. She had stood in his empty schoolroom and understood that a wrong in the accounts was not only an error in figures, but a taking from a person who had earned what was taken. She made copies of the relevant receipts and figures that night, by candlelight, in the clear hand her father had praised. She told herself she would decide what to do with them when she was certain. She told herself she was not yet certain. This was the first time she lied to herself in the whole of the matter, and she recognized it as a lie before she had finished telling it. The Duke of Harwell had inherited the title 14 months ago, after the death of his elder brother Julian, and he had not yet made his peace with the house. Edgar Ashton was 36 years old, tall, with dark hair that had not been fashionable since his brother's tenure, and which he did not notice. His face was the kind of face that gave nothing easily, and the household had concluded in the first weeks of his tenure that he was cold, which was not entirely wrong, and was not entirely right. He was a man accustomed to the role of second son, which meant he had a second son's habits, observing rooms more than commanding them, keeping his opinions until they were required, and holding his certainties close in case they were wrong. He had learned to doubt his certainties. He had learned this on a morning in November the previous year, in a lane 2 miles from Harwell, when his brother's horse had come down on ground the groom had warned was uncertain, and Edgar, who had been riding ahead, had not turned back for 11 minutes. Julian had died of the injury 2 days later. The interval had made no practical difference to the outcome. Edgar believed this with the intellectual portion of his mind, and could not make the other portion believe it at all. He had lived inside that dissonance for 14 months. It had not diminished. He trusted Cornelius Fenn because Fenn was certain. Fenn had managed the estate for Edgar's father, and then for Julian, with a confidence that produced results. And in the month since Edgar had inherited, Fenn's certainty had been the ground under him when his own footing was unsure. He relied on it the way a man with a bad ankle relies on a walking stick, without particularly examining how the stick was made or whether it would hold. It was a Thursday evening in late April when Edgar came to the small library to retrieve a lease document and found instead a maid on her knees before the reading table with a candle burned down to its socket and 2 open volumes of estate accounts arranged before her, alongside a smaller, older ledger he did not recognize. He stood in the doorway. She did not hear him. Her lips were moving slightly as she ran her finger down a column of figures, and then she stopped and went back up the column, and then she made a small sound that was not a word. More like the sound a person makes when a suspicion is confirmed and the confirmation is not welcome. He watched her for what he estimated was 1 full minute. She was slight, with dark hair pinned beneath her cap, and her hands on the ledger were the hands of someone accustomed to working with small precision, each finger deliberate. She was not reading carelessly. She was reading with the attention of someone who understood what she was reading and had found something in it that mattered. She sensed him, eventually, the way people sense observation when it has been sustained long enough. Her head came up. She looked at him with the specific steadiness of a person deciding, in the space of 2 seconds, whether to pretend she had been doing something else, and then deciding, visibly, not to. "Your Grace," she said. "What is it?" he said. It was not a question. She told him. She told him in the precise, economical language of a person who had spent 3 days organizing her evidence before she could be certain she was right. And she was correct about every figure she cited, and she knew she was correct. And he could see that she knew. She described the quarry discrepancy, the delivery receipt, the address in the village. She cited figures from memory without error. She kept her voice at an even register and her hands at her sides, and she met his gaze throughout, because she had decided before he arrived that if this moment came, she would not perform uncertainty she did not feel. He stood at the table and read what she indicated, and the silence in the room was the silence of something shifting that could not be unshifted. "Stop," he said, when she began gathering the papers to leave. "Sit down. Show me what you have found from the beginning." His voice was not warm. She sat down. Lady Mira Ashton had occupied the dower cottage at Harwell since Julian's death, which was her right. And she exercised the rights of a widow with the thoroughness of a woman who had discovered, in the aftermath of grief, that the routines of authority were more bearable than the absence of the thing authority was supposed to organize. She was 41, elegant, and accustomed to being listened to. She did not find Edgar as legible as Julian had been, which she attributed to a failure of character on Edgar's part. When Delia came to the Duke's study the following morning, at the hour he had specified, she waited in the corridor for 8 minutes before being admitted, and then laid the accounts on the desk with the delivery receipts arranged beneath them, and explained in a clear voice what the figures meant. Lady Mira was in the room because she had arrived for her own appointment and had not been asked to leave. It was Lady Mira who spoke first. "Edgar," she said, in the tone of a woman adjusting a painting that has been placed at a slight angle, "Fen has served this family since before you were born. Whatever this girl believes she has found, I would suggest it admits of an explanation that does not require you to question the integrity of a man who has given 30 years of loyal service to the Ashton name." She did not look at Delia. She is a maid, and nothing more. This is not her concern. Delia kept her eyes on the Duke. He was reading the receipts. He said, without looking up, "Thank you, Mira. I will consider it." He dismissed Lady Mira then, which was not the same thing as dismissing Delia, and Lady Mira noted the distinction as she left. The interview that followed lasted 40 minutes. He asked precise questions, and she gave precise answers, and at no point did he tell her she was right or wrong, or welcome or unwelcome. He kept his face in a particular arrangement that gave her nothing to read, and she found, to her own quiet frustration, that she kept trying to read it anyway. His hands were still on the desk the whole of the interview, as still as the rest of him, and there was a small scar at his right knuckle that she noticed. Because she noticed everything, and immediately considered whether this was a character defect. "You will say nothing of this to anyone," he said, at the end. She understood it as a command, and obeyed it. Fen had not survived 30 years in a great house without a sensitivity to the quality of attention directed at him. In the days following the interview, he felt the particular coolness that precedes a change in weather, and he was not a man given to panic. He was a man given to preemption. He waited until he had an audience. The opportunity came on a Monday afternoon when Delia was crossing the servants' hall with a basket of folded linens, and 4 of the footmen and the scullery maid were present. He called her name in the carrying voice he used for announcements. "You will not concern yourself with estate business," he said. "You are a maid, and nothing more. If I find that you have been in the account room or the library for any purpose beyond your duties, I will have you dismissed without a character." The footman's eyes went to the floor. The scullery maid went very still. Delia set down the basket of linens. She looked at him steadily and said, "Yes, Mr. Fen." She picked up the basket and walked out. She was not shaking when she reached her corridor. She checked. She told Mrs. Yateley that evening, not because she wanted to, but because the housekeeper had a right to know what was happening under her own roof, and because Delia had begun to understand that she would need a witness, and that witnesses required the chance to become witnesses before the moment arrived. Mrs. Yateley listened without interrupting. When Delia finished, the housekeeper was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap in the manner of a woman who has learned to hold her reactions until she has decided what to do with them. "I saw a delivery," she said slowly. "Last October, to Fenn's house in the village. A cart from the Henton quarry. I thought nothing of it at the time. I assumed it was his own business." They looked at each other across the small table in the housekeeper's sitting room. "I should have asked," Mrs. Yateley said. "You did not know there was a reason to ask," Delia said. "You know now." She poured the tea, and they sat with it in a companionable silence that had the quality of an alliance, which was exactly what it was. It was the end of April when the Duke found her in the library again. Not by accident. He had come deliberately, at the hour she had begun to come, which he knew because he had noticed and had not examined his reasons for noticing. She was at the reading table with a new candle and the same worn ledger, and she looked up when he entered, and did not flinch. He had been in the hunting room that afternoon. He went there sometimes, in the late light, when the particular quality of the quiet reminded him of the morning Julian died, and he stood in it until the reminder became bearable again. He went to the hunting room less often than he had in the first months. He could not say precisely why. He sat down across the table from her without asking whether she minded. He looked at the smaller ledger. "Is that yours?" he said. "My father's," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He was the Kingmore schoolmaster. She had not told him this. She was briefly arrested by the realization that he had sought that information separately and had not mentioned having done so. "He was," she said. "How did he die?" "A fever." Quickly. A pause, and then because something in his stillness invited more, the way certain rooms invite the truth simply by being quiet enough. "He left a debt he did not know he had. A man had been taking from the parish account while my father administered it. He never knew. I believe he would have considered it a worse injury than the debt itself." The Duke looked at the table. His hands were on the wood, very still. Outside the window the evening light was going, that slow British reluctance in which the dark arrives by degrees rather than all at once. "My brother's horse came down," he said, "on a November morning. The groom had said the ground was uncertain. I had ridden ahead and did not turn back immediately." He stopped. Then, in a lower register, he said, "Fenn was certain, when I came to this estate, that the matter was managed, and that my attention was not required on it. I have relied on that certainty, because I have found my own unreliable." She held what he had told her carefully, the way she held figures that mattered, because figures that mattered deserved to be held carefully before anything was done with them. "You did not choose the ground," she said. "The man who chose the accounts was not you." He looked at her. It was a long look, the kind that arrived at the end of a calculation, and there was something in it that she felt in her throat before she recognized what it was. "No," he said. He was not. He opened her father's worn ledger then, with a care that she noted and did not remark on, and read Thomas Marsh's handwriting in the candlelight, all those patient columns, the careful sums of a village life. He did not speak while he read. She did not speak either. The candle burned, and the evening went out, and it was the most companionable silence she had sat inside since her father died. Before he left, he said, "You will not go down to the servants' hall tonight." "You will remain in Mrs. Yately's rooms," she said. "Yes, Your Grace." She understood now what his commands meant. There are stories where the good act does not go punished before it is rewarded. But this was not one of them. The punishing came first. 3 days before Augustus Sewell arrived from London, Fenn went to the Duke's study in the morning and laid before him a folded paper. He had been rehearsing it. She would understand later, for at least a week. He said that a sum had gone missing from the household accounts. A small sum, £8 and 6 shillings. He paused with the timing of a man who knows how pauses work. The only person with access to that ledger in the relevant period, he said, was the maid in the East Wing. He said nothing about the East Wing maid's name. He did not need to. There was only one maid in the East Wing. Lady Mira, summoned and breathless, said from the doorway, "I told you, Edgar. This is what comes of giving audience to a servant. She has fabricated evidence and now attempted to cover it by taking what she could lay hands on. You must dismiss her immediately. Today." He said nothing. "Edgar," Lady Mira said with more urgency. He said, "Send Mrs. Yately to me." The hours that followed were the worst of Delia's 11 months at Harwell. She sat in Mrs. Yately's room and held her father's ledger in both hands and counted its worn corners and told herself that the truth of a column of figures does not change because someone has found it inconvenient. She told herself this 7 times. The 7th time was the most convincing. She told herself also that she had already done the necessary thing 3 days prior, when she had ridden to the county town with the Morning Post cart and presented herself to the offices of Sewell and Crane, solicitors, and laid before the senior partner a copy of the relevant receipts and figures, with her own careful summary of what they indicated, and asked whether, in his professional opinion, this constituted a matter requiring legal attention. Sewell had read it in 20 minutes and sent his letter to Harwell before the post closed. What she did not know, waiting in Mrs. Yately's room, was that Edgar had read Sewell's letter 4 hours before Fenn arrived with his accusation, and had said nothing to anyone about it, and had been watching Fenn's face very carefully all morning. Mrs. Yately returned from the Duke with a message. Delia was not to be dismissed. She was not to come to any part of the house where Fenn might encounter her until further instruction. She was to remain where she was, and she was to trust that the matter was in hand. Delia read this message twice. She noticed that it said, "Trust." She had not expected that word from him, and finding it there was like finding a sum that had balanced after a long uncertainty. She sat with her father's ledger and waited. It was at dinner that evening, in front of Lord Carter and a neighbor's wife and a cousin visiting for the fortnight, that Lady Mira's voice carried from the drawing-room through the open door of the anteroom where Delia was setting out the coffee service. "She is a maid and nothing more," Lady Mira said, with the lightness of a woman who found the whole matter mildly diverting. "I cannot imagine why Edgar has given her any audience at all. She has made some claim about the accounts, which is an impertinence so singular I have not yet decided what to do with it, and I suspect she will be gone by the fortnight." The Duke was standing in the doorway of the anteroom. He had come from the study. He had heard it. He looked at Delia, who was holding the coffee tray in both hands with an expression of absolute steadiness, and then he looked at Lady Mira through the open door with an expression that Lady Mira would reflect on. For some considerable time, he held the anteroom door for Delia to pass through with the tray, and she passed through it, and he followed. Augustus Sewell was a compact, exact man of 52 who had the manner of a person who had been told too many secrets over too long a career to be surprised by any individual secret, and who had consequently developed a quality of calm that placed everyone around him at a slight disadvantage. He arrived on a Friday morning and went immediately to the Duke's study, and they were closeted there for 2 hours, while the household went about its business with the heightened awareness of a house that knows something is about to resolve. Fen had known Sewell was in the house within the first hour. He did not know the precise nature of the engagement, but he had been in service long enough to distinguish a social call from a professional one. He spent the morning in the estate office with the composure of a man who has done nothing wrong, which is also, when needed, the composure of a man who has done something wrong and has decided to maintain the appearance of the former position until circumstances prove otherwise. At 11 o'clock, the Duke sent word that the household was to assemble. They came to the great hall with the gradations of their positions visible in how close each person stood to the front. Mrs. Yattley near the door to the passage. The footmen behind her in their careful order. The kitchen staff farther back. Delia to one side, in the position of a person uncertain of her place, which she had occupied for 11 months and was accustomed to. The morning was cold, a thin light coming through the high windows of the hall in the specific colorless way of December, and the 37 members of the household arranged themselves as they always did in the ordering of their positions, which was a grammar Delia had learned as well as any other. The footmen in their livery, the kitchen staff in their working dress. Mrs. Yattley, with the composure of a woman who has spent 30 years ensuring that whatever happened in this house, it happened in an orderly manner. Sewell stood beside the Duke. Lord Carter had been summoned from the breakfast room and stood to one side. Lady Mira was near the corridor door, which might have been coincidence, or might not. The Duke said, without preamble, "Mr. Sewell will speak to what he has found." Sewell spoke for 12 minutes. He cited figures with the precision of a man whose profession depends on the accuracy of figures, and who has staked his reputation on these particular ones. The diversion of quarry fees, the timber contracts, 3 of them, over 4 years, each underbilled by a specific documented amount. The stone delivered to a house in the village at estate expense, £420 over 7 years, in increments calibrated to remain below the threshold of individual scrutiny, a method Sewell described without editorial comment as systematic and deliberate. He mentioned, without emphasis, that the copy of receipts and figures he had received had been prepared with considerable accuracy by a member of the household staff. He did not name her. The room did not need him to. Fenn's face, in the silence that followed, was the face of a man watching the ground he had stood on for 30 years reveal itself as borrowed ground. Lady Mira spoke into the silence. "This is absurd. Cornelius has served this family. Mira." The Duke's voice was not loud. It had the quality of a sentence that does not need volume. "I have asked you not to finish that sentence." She stopped. Lord Carter cleared his throat with the delicacy of a man who is present at a significant moment and wishes to ensure that the record, should there be one, reflects that he was present. One of the footmen was watching Delia with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Then the Duke crossed the room. He crossed it with the directness of a man who has decided where he is going and has stopped troubling himself with the opinion of those in between. He stopped in front of Delia, and the hall was entirely quiet, the kind of quiet that a crowd produces when it collectively holds its breath. "Miss Marsh is my witness, my steward, and my intended." He said it at a volume sufficient for the hall to hear it, in the level declarative tone of a man stating a fact that had been true for some time and was simply now being recorded. His eyes were on her face, and not on the room. She felt the pulse in her throat. She felt the worn corner of her father's ledger under her thumb, which she had been pressing without knowing it. He said it more quietly, for her alone. "Delia." The first time he had ever used it. She understood what it cost him and what it meant, and she held it in the same manner she held every figure that mattered, with care and without wasting it. "Your Grace," she said. A breath. "Edgar." Something in his face, at that, came loose in the particular way of things that have been held rigidly in place for a long time and are finally allowed to settle. Lord Carter made a sound that was not quite a cough. Mrs. Yately's hands were very still at her sides. Lady Mira had gone to the color of old plaster, and her fan had stopped moving. Sewell said, in his measured professional voice, "I will need a word with Mr. Fenn, Your Grace, and afterward with yourself, regarding the matter of recovery and the relevant statute." "Yes," Edgar said. He had not looked away from Delia. Fenn was escorted by Sewell to the estate office. Lady Mira left the hall by the corridor door. The household dispersed by degrees, with the careful quietness of people who have witnessed something they understand they will carry for a long time. Mrs. Yately passed Delia on her way out. She said nothing. She pressed Delia's arm once, with both hands, and was gone. The winter came early to Harwell that year, and it settled in the rooms of the house with a different quality than the winter before. Edgar and Delia were married by the vicar of Kingmore in the first week of December, in the small stone church where Thomas Marsh had taught for 22 years, and where his name was on a small brass plate near the vestry door, placed there by the parish that spring. There were 12 people present. The ceremony was quiet and particular, and entirely sufficient. The way things are when they are arrived at honestly. Lord Carter stood witness and made his sound once more, which Delia had by now identified as his mode of expressing things that sat outside his vocabulary. Mrs. Yately stood on the other side and did not make a sound, which was more eloquent. The estate had a new steward by Christmas, a young man from the county with a quiet competence that Edgar had assessed carefully, and Delia had assessed more carefully still. She had reviewed the first quarter's accounts herself, at the new steward's own invitation, which was a gesture she suspected Edgar had arranged, and which she accepted without remark, sitting at the reading table in the small library with 2 candles lit, and the figures opening before her the way a landscape opens when you have climbed to the right height. They were correct. Every column, every sum. She traced them with the same finger her father had taught her to use, moving down the page with patient care. And when she reached the end and found them right, she allowed herself a small, private satisfaction that she would not have been able to explain to anyone, but would have recognized her father. Lady Mira removed to her sister's house in Bath in November, which was the resolution of the natural kind, the kind that produces necessary distance without requiring anyone to be cruel about it. Edgar accepted her departure with equanimity. Distance had been his native country for a long time. He was learning to distinguish the distance that protects from the distance that withholds. The estate was quieter without her. The accounts were cleaner. Both improvements were related. On a Sunday evening in late December, with the fire lit in the small library and snow falling on the grounds in the particular, slow, deliberate manner of snow that intends to stay, Delia was sitting in the chair her father would have chosen, near the light, with a book open in her lap that she was not reading. The worn ledger with the torn corner was on the table beside her. She had placed it there when they came in that evening. Edgar had carried it from her room for her, because his hands had understood before the rest of him what it meant to her, and he had carried it as carefully as she had. He came to sit beside her, not across from her, but beside her, which was a change she had noticed, and held the way she held all things that mattered. The fire was burning low, and the snow was falling, and the house was very quiet in the specific way of houses that have been set in order. She picked up the ledger. She opened it to the first page, where her father had written in his careful schoolmaster's hand the heading of his accounts and the name of the village and the year, and below it, in smaller writing she had read so many times, It had the weight of a kept promise. Let every figure be as true as you can make it. She showed it to Edgar. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over and turned to the second page, and the third, and read the careful columns in the firelight without speaking. And she watched his face as he read and found in it the expression of a man learning something true about a person he was glad to have been given time to know. The snow went on falling. The fire went on burning. In the morning, there would be the new quarters deliveries to review, and a letter from Sewell regarding the matter of recovery, and the head gardener's report on the kitchen garden beds for the spring planting, and all the accumulated ordinary business of a house settling into itself. That was the morning. This was the evening, and the evening held, and it was enough. Thank you for staying to the end of Delia's story. If her father's ledger moved you, leave a word in the comments. There are more stories on this channel for those who love them.